Okay, so I hope the PPT is visible.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, okay. So, before we leave our discussion on the ecosystem, there is a very important aspect which I wanted to bring to your notice. And as shown in the title here, that many of these ecosystems, so to speak, we learned last time the different components, the different properties of the ecosystem. I will only review it for a minute, that the levels of hierarchy, the organization which you saw in the ecosystem, that is, you have a source of energy, then you have a producer, then there is a primary consumer, the secondary, the tertiary consumer, so on and so forth. And similarly, we also learned about the set point controls. That is, just as an organism, for example, is very tightly regulated, you see that the ecosystem is far more flexible and it has boundaries, but which are quite adaptable. So while an organism is regulated by the level of hormones or the reproductive rates, etc., there is no such tight control or what we call as a set genetic control as far as an ecosystem is concerned. So therefore, it has a large buffering capacity. We looked at unusual members like, corals and all that, where you saw how interestingly, how the different polyps and uh, and the ones which can photosynthesize, for example, are linked together. You looked at the trophic structure, which is the way the energy flows within the ecosystem. Then we also looked at a very complex network of metabolism, which is operating the microbial loops. And finally, the new emergent properties in the ecosystem. Again, we took an example of the coral reef to emphasize that properties which are not present in the individual components, however, when these are collectively present in an ecosystem, they could display very new kind of properties, which are called as the emergent properties. So now what I wanted to discuss today a little bit about are the modeling of the ecosystems. Okay, because you have seen yourself that it has extremely complex features, etc. So let us say that there is a pond ecosystem or some kind of a forest ecosystem where you would like to know what is the sequence of events, how much of energy really falls on that particular forest, how much is captured by the photosynthetic organisms, and then how much is taken forward, for example, or what leaves the system, in terms of the products like fruits, vegetables, etc., which are taken away from the forests, etc. So all of these complexities can actually be numerically understood by means of modeling. Okay, that is what we call as an ecosystem model. Now, during the lecture, if you feel that you would like me to come back and explain something to you again, please stop me right there so that I can try to explain it a little bit better to you. So modeling can be applied to an ecosystem. All right. So what is the basic purpose of modeling an ecosystem? The point which is shown on the right is that these models are aimed at mimicking the real world phenomena. That is, how much can we really understand? How much can we mimic? And the basic idea is that you want to give some kind of a numerical number to the processes which are happening. So when it is about the producers or the plants or the photosynthetic algae which are able to capture the sunlight, you want to put a numeric to it so that you are better able to understand as to what is happening in the system. And this kind of a modeling is expected to answer a fundamental question, that if something happens, if there is a fall in the solar energy, or if some nutrient is limiting in the system, then what is the outcome? How is it going to impact the ecosystem? Okay, just like any other model, you would like to be able to understand all the variables which are interacting with each other, and eventually, if something were to happen, how is it going to impact the ecosystem? That is the purpose of modeling an ecosystem. Okay, so now here I have just tried to put down, just to remind you, that whenever you try to build such a model for any kind of an ecosystem, like a pond ecosystem or a forest ecosystem or a lake ecosystem, for example, the system is usually presented right in the middle. So it could be, as it shows here, it could be a block of forest. it could be section of a beach, or it could be the shore, that is the side of a lake, which by itself is a unique ecosystem that is kept in the middle, like you see here, which is delimited. By delimited, what we mean is that there are no closed boundaries here. There are things which are already entering into the system at all times. This is called as the input environment. Okay, and what, yeah, go on.
The slides are freezed
And
at
slide is
slide
not
number
moving.
one. Means we are still on slide one.
Okay, let's wait for a second. Let's wait for a second. Maybe the net is slow today. So can you see this ecosystem model slide? Not
No,
as yet. Not,
it's on the return is lecture 3 ecosystem modeling and marine ecosystem, which is slide number one.
okay, let me go back
Yes,
here.
ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Now it's visible.
I
Now it
see.
is
So
moving, ma'am.
maybe, what I will do, maybe I will not switch to the full PPT mode. So is this is okay now?
Yes,
Is
ma'am.
it?
It is.
Oh, all right. So as I had mentioned a while ago, that the system or the ecosystem is kept in the center, as you see here, and it is shown as being delimited, which is, that is, it is an open system, and there are constantly things which are entering into the ecosystem. There are things which are constantly leaving the ecosystem. So when you look at the input variables, what goes into the ecosystem? Sun, of course, the solar energy, which is the primary source of energy, which is always entering into any ecosystem. Okay, so you could be dealing, I will again take the same examples, that you could be dealing with a pond or a lake or a beach, for example, which is a small ecosystem, but it is the energy which is constantly entering. Apart from sun, there could be other sources of energy also, which are written here. For example, the wind energy, the rain, which comes with water, or water flow at a very high intensity, or fossil fuels, for example, etc. So all of these are also constantly entering into the ecosystem. So apart from the energy sources, there is also material which is entering. What is that material? The material could be immigration of organisms. For example, the seeds which are brought in by air into this, they could land up in this particular ecosystem, or you could have spores or reproductive stages of different microorganisms or different kind of animals could be entering into this system. So both material as well as energy is constantly entering into the ecosystem. Then on this side, what we see here is an output environment. So what is the output which is coming? It could be processed energy, like, biological respiration, for example. So if there are biological organisms which are living, whatever energy enters into the system. So, this energy for a photosynthetic system is the solar energy. But for a non-photosynthetic system, such as an animal, which is a primary consumer or a secondary consumer, they could be feeding themselves on the fruits or the plants which are made by producers. And as a result of which, as a result of breakdown of that organic material, respiration is going to occur. So, some kind of heat is dissipated out, some energy also comes out of the system, which is called as a processed energy, as well as materials, which could be either food or waste products, or it could be some kind of pollutants, or it could be e-migration, or, in other words, there could be some animals, etc., which are leaving constantly your ecosystem. So whenever you are trying to model, in other words, an ecosystem, all these parameters need to be taken into account. That is, what is the input into the system, and and what is the output of the system. And in between the numbers, the numerics have to be also considered. Per square area, if the total area of the ecosystem is so much, then per square area you will carry out a biological sampling. It is not, the model has to be fed with the real life data. So you have to figure out, you have to sample a small area to know how many plants are there, what kind of plants are going to be these. Similarly, what are the primary, what are the secondary consumers, etc. So all that information that you collect through sampling also goes into defining a system. Okay, and the output environment based on the biochemistry of these various things, you will be able to figure out the output of this system. Okay. So this is the way the ecosystems are modeled. Okay, and and over the course of time, what I will also suggest is that you know, two or three, when it comes to writing a term paper, two or three students could get together and they could do a case study, because such kind of models have been built on a large number of ecological systems. And just to give the rest of the class an idea as to how ecosystems can be modeled, maybe three students can take up that paper. One could talk about how the sampling is carried out, the other could look at the energetics, how these are computed, and finally put the model together. The third student could learn and, you know, and put down a model to explain to rest of the class as to how these ecosystems can be modeled. Okay. So now let me give you an example here of a very, very simple model which is developed. Now, what you see, this is the way that, you know, the picture which I showed you earlier in slide 3 was a very general kind of a diagram. But now this is called as a compartment diagram or a flow diagram, where we can try to understand what are the different components and how does the energy flow through the different components in the ecosystem. Okay, so the ecosystem which is described here could be, it is only a very representative ecosystem. It could be an example of developing photochemical smog in the air. Okay, so smog is something which we keep constantly talking about because of you know, when you talk about pollution, etc., you talk about smog, especially in big cities. It is a constant problem. So here is how a model would look like if photochemical smog is to be modeled. Okay, so what you see here, the closed boundary, is that of photochemical smog right here. Okay, and E is the energy, which is in this case the solar energy. F are the flow pathways. So the arrow which you see here, for example, and you know, it says F1 on the top. So all of these are explained here. So this E, for example, if we move to the right, E stands for an energy source or other forcing function. By forcing function, what we mean is that this is something to which the variables P1 and P2, these are the state variables, which are going to respond to the function, which is actually the solar energy. Or it could be the wind energy, or it could be some force which force upon the variables to carry out a certain function. Okay, so I hope that terminology is clear to everybody. So E, for example, is a source of energy, and you will see here on the right, and this is an explanation. E is an energy source or other forcing function. P is a state variable. That is, these are the parameters which are going to respond to E. And the symbols which are used here, for example, if it is a circle. So in these ecosystem diagrams, there are these symbols which are used for a unique set. If it is a circle, that means it is always a source of energy. If it is a rectangle, that means it is a variable which is going to respond to this external energy source. Okay, so I hope it is clear. So a rectangle is actually a variable which is going to respond to this particular function, forcing function, in other words. And if you see a diagram like this, which is actually, you know, it is a hexagon only. And so what you see here, for example, a hexagon always represents an interacting function. So you see I here, I means there is some kind of an interaction which is going on between the two variables, that is P1 and P2. Some kind of an interaction, and this interaction is going to affect the third function, which is now shown as P3, which is a variable. And at every point, the F1, F2, the F3, the F4, F5 are the energy flows. That is how much of that energy is going to flow to the next one, to the next variable, which you have here. And finally, you see that there is something which is going out from the system also, which is, and then you see another thing which is marked here, which is called as L. All right, L means a feedback loop. So something which is coming out at this particular stage, okay, it could be a nutrient or in the case of smog, it could be like an ozone being formed, something else which is formed, which is also going to affect, for example, the interaction, or it may affect, for example, the P1 function. So feedback loops are constantly also a part of the ecosystem model. Okay, so is this clear to everybody as to what these different terms mean in the model of an ecosystem?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, all right. So now the basic diagram which I have shown you here of an ecosystem model, we are going to apply it to a specific system. For example, a photochemical smog in the air. If you want to model it, for example, so P1 here variable, like it shows here, these are the hydrocarbons in the air. Now, where do the hydrocarbons in the air appear? It is because of automobile combustion. You have, xylenes, or you have other kind of hydrocarbons which are constantly released into the air because of combustion of the fossil fuel. So this could be one variable here. And that is what exactly happens when you talk about smog formation. It is the interaction between the hydrocarbons and P2, which is another variable which is already present in the ecosystem of the photochemical smog. And these are the nitrogen oxides, such as nitric oxide or nitrogen dioxide like NO2, which are also released due to combustion of the fuel, automobile fuel. Okay, so these two components are already present in the air. All right, so now both of these can interact with, so these hydrocarbons are due to the energy, the solar energy which falls on the system. These hydrocarbons are going to be oxidized, and at the same time, these hydrocarbons, they also interact with the nitric oxide. So there is a chemical interaction, there is a chemical reaction, so to speak, which is occurring between this and this component. All right, so these are interacting with each other, and that is what is shown here. So something novel kind of compounds are being formed because of the interaction of P1 and P2, and this is going to affect, for example, the as a result of which photochemical smog is formed. Okay, so I here is a facilitator function, or in other words, it is an interaction, because the symbol which you see here is that of interaction. Okay, so a typical photochemical smog, for example, can be modeled by knowing what is the, so in a given geographical area, for example, you have an average idea that there are so many petrol vehicles which are going, and you can compute actually how much of hydrocarbon is likely to be present in the air, how much of nitric oxide or or oxides of nitrogen are going to be released in the air because of the footprint, because of the number of vehicles which are operating in that particular geographical regions. Okay, so by virtue of that, by virtue of the interaction and the stoichiometry of the reaction, you can also predict, for example, in the presence of the solar energy, okay, how much of smog is likely to be formed. Okay, so if, for example, so this model is built, and at the same time, if the nitrogen oxides are going to be increased, or if, for example, the hydrocarbons are going to be increased because of fuel burning, not only the automobile fuel, but woods are also burnt in certain areas which can release hydrocarbons. Okay, so if that happens, computer simulation of these models can also be carried out, which can predict as to what is the eventual, like, this is a classical example where we did have smog formation because of automobile combustion, but now because of what happens in the borders of Punjab and Haryana, there is wood burning. Okay, as a result of which you don't have necessarily nitrogen oxides which are going to be released, but then you do increase the hydrocarbons in the air because of wood burning. So computer simulation can then carry out to see that if, for example, if the level of P1 increases in the system, then what is the likely outcome on the smog formation. Okay, so I hope you can appreciate as to how this kind of a model which you can do, this is for a small scenario, which is very, very restricted, but you can also apply the same thing. So I hope you try to appreciate, for example, that what are the benefits of developing such a model for a part of the ecosystem, like development of a photochemical smog in the air, or as we are going to learn about the second, that is in the grassland ecosystem, that you are in a position to predict that if hydrocarbon content increases in the air due to wood burning, as we are doing after the harvest in the month of November, we are burning. So more of these hydrocarbons are liberated. So now it leads to formation of excessive smog. So these are the things which can be predicted, in other words. So this is what such a model allows you to do. Now, the second example, which I'm going to illustrate to you via this model, is that of a grassland ecosystem. Okay, so by and large, similar kind of exactly the same diagram can also be used to explain what are the events, what are the energy functions, what are the state variables, etc., which are operating in a grassland ecosystem, and it allows you to model this ecosystem. Okay, now in this case, what we are going to look at, E is of course the source of energy, which is going to be again the solar energy, and P1 and P2. P1 could be a producer. Like it says here, P1 are the plants. So these are the producers which are able to capture the solar energy and fix it in the form of organic carbon. Now these organic carbon is now, there is a certain amount of energy, like the fruits, etc., are really taken as a source of energy for heterotrophic organisms or for the primary consumers. So they are going to consume a part of it, for example. So P2 are the herbivores, which directly feed themselves on the green produce which is made here. But only a certain amount of energy flows into this system. Okay, now there could be some kind of an interaction. This interaction could be quite variable. For example, in a grassland ecosystem, it could be that for P3, all right, which is the next level of consumer, it doesn't really care, and it could be taking only P2, or it could be taking a part of this and part of this. For example, it could be an omnivore, could depend partially on the fruits and the produce, for example, and it could take 80% of the herbivores. Okay, so P3 here is the secondary consumer, which could be an omnivore. That is, they can feed themselves on the plant produced matter like fruits and vegetables, etc. They could also feed themselves on something like the herbivores, etc. All right, so this interaction function in that case could define how the next level is going to depend, or it could be this interaction function could tell you the seasonal preferences. So P3 here could be, it becomes, it feeds itself on the fruits and vegetables during one season, and and this during some other season, etc. So this could be a variable here, and how much of the energy is going to flow can now be computed here. And so in other words, such kind of a model can also be applied to a grassland ecosystem. Okay, so is this clear to everybody?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. All right. So now let me move to the next slide. What we looked at in the last slide was a relatively very clear and a simple system. But apart from that, there are today there is advanced modeling tools which are available, which take several factors into consideration when you talk about an ecosystem. So in this picture, what we are looking at is something which is extremely complex. And here is the boundary of a very complex ecosystem. And as it says here, it is an ecosystem. Sun, which is in the form of energy, enters into the ecosystem. Materials in the source of nutrients are entering into the system. Source of organic matter, which could be, animals which are moving into this ecosystem, etc. And S here. So now you see there is a different symbol here from what we have seen in the earlier picture. Okay, a symbol like that is supposed to signify the storage. So many of the nutrients could be stored here, and this symbol which you see here is called as a producer. Okay, so you have a rectangle, but then you have this kind of a edge. It has a round edge. So such a symbol is always used in ecosystem modeling to indicate which is an autotroph. So A stands for autotroph, hexagon stands for the heterotroph here. But this hexagon is very different from the interaction that I showed you that symbol earlier, which also has 6 sides, except that is used for that is used to define interaction. So here we have all of these heterotrophs. So in other words, the solar energy is taken up, it is fixed by autotrophs, and there is a certain proportion of that energy which is taken up, and then it is taken up in the form of organic matter, or it is consumed by the heterotrophs, consumed by other levels of heterotrophs, so on and so forth. Okay, so such kind of models are quite possible to be done, quite possible to be made. So now the function of this, for example, is so here is a picture as to how, for instance, this energy flow diagram has been calculated for a lake, for a freshwater ecosystem. All right, so these are the autotrophs which are at the base of this energy pyramids. And so much of energy which is actually computed in terms of gram calorie per centimeter square per year. Okay, so much of energy falls on the autotroph. So GP refers to the gross production, and out of this solar radiation, so much of energy which falls on the autotroph, only 111 gram calorie per square centimeter per year is captured by the autotroph. So if you see, this only represents 0.1% of the total energy which is radiant on the autotroph. Only a small percentage is captured. Okay, so all of these energy, for example, values can be computed in an ecosystem. Then you have the herbivores and gross production. You see that it is only 15 out of 111, which is now captured by the herbivores. The rest of the produce, what happens to it? Either it simply decomposes, or it is not utilized at all, or through biological respiration, okay, quite a bit of it is lost, or it may not be utilized at all. So as I had shown you in the energy pyramid, that just about 10% of the energy which is captured here moves to the next stage. So these could be called as the primary consumers, and then you have the secondary consumers, so on and so forth. And GP refers to the gross production. Okay, so such kind of energetics have been in detail carried out on different kind of ecosystems. So therefore, when you start with a pond as an ecosystem, it may look extremely complex, but once you start to break it down into individual components like the producers, the primary consumers, etc., there are very good and very predictable models which can be constructed, which will allow you to understand an ecosystem better. Okay, and eventually the idea is to conserve all of these ecosystems only by learning their dynamics. So is this clear? Can we move to the next stage now?
Yes, ma'am.
Any other from any other student, any questions on something which you want clarification about? Yes or no? Anybody else in the class?
Ma'am, why autotrophs takes a very less amount of energy, ma'am?
That is the nature of the solar energy, that it is still in very dilute form. Like if you look at the same thing, the solar cells, for example, they are able to capture only a very small part of the energy. So the autotrophic system are still not efficient enough to be able to capture all the energy which falls on them. So quite a bit of energy which falls on a leaf, which is the photosynthetic organ, much of it is reflected back, because leaves have waxes on them or protective layers outside, and quite a bit of it gets reflected back, and only a part of this energy enters into the photosynthetic system. So they are still not very efficient.
Ma'am,
Okay.
what does 118372 represent?
Okay, that is the total amount of, so it is 1,18,872 gram calorie of energy per square centimeter per year, which falls on the autotrophs of that given ecosystem.
Yes, ma'am. So can we say, ma'am, energy is equivalent to gross product?
Yeah, absolutely. Because that is the way that they have defined that gross production is, that is the unit of energy which they are, that is the way they are defining gross production here as. Okay, so it is just to give you an idea that there is a number which can be assigned to it. How much of solar radiation irradiates on a given ecosystem which has a geographical boundary, and you know what are the plant species here. And as I said earlier, that some kind of a sampling has to be done before you do this kind of a modeling. Sampling has to be done of how many trees are there, what is the total energy which falls on this square meter, for example. So that's the reason why area is also given here and time is also given here. And it's only on the basis of that that numbers can be assigned at each one of these locations. So I'll give you the reference also, then please have a look at it. So now so having understood now about the basic definition, I will only give you one example, that of a marine ecosystem, in order for you to appreciate, for example, the complexities of a real life ecosystem. Because so far, although we talked about a pond ecosystem, but we did not look at it in detail in terms of the different components, etc. So there are just some examples I have listed here, like when you talk about water bodies, there are ecosystems which are in the water bodies. It could be either in the lake, it could be in the river, or it could be in a marine ecosystem. And even within the marine ecosystem, first of all, how is it really different? Is it because it refers to the ecosystems which are prevalent in the oceans. And those kind of ecosystems are referred to as marine ecosystems, because salinity is very high here and the temperatures do not vary so much. Because in the oceans you have saline water, and similarly the temperature of the oceans is nearly constant. Okay, so therefore these are quite different from what you will see. Lakes can get very cold, or similarly rivers, etc. They can be freshwater lakes, etc., so on and so forth. But here is an ecosystem which is quite different. Okay, because of these two properties, the temperature and a saline environment. And that's what you find in the oceans. And it has and the significance of for environmental engineering of these. Similarly, when you look at the land ecosystems or the terrestrial ecosystems, soil ecosystem, for example, is people have tried to understand, or what is just below the soil, which is the deep subsurface, or the wetlands, or the marshy lands, so on and so forth. So several of these, things which you see outside can be understood in terms of very well-defined ecosystem. So here is very quickly to give you an idea of the marine ecosystem. So is this slide visible to everybody on the marine ecosystem?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, all right. So please pay attention, because there are a lot of very, very interesting and new things which you are going to see in this slide, and you will certainly begin to appreciate that how important it is for all of us. Now there are different, first of all, in oceans there are different kind of ecosystems. Okay, like mangrove in West Bengal, we have what are called as the Sundarbans, mangrove forest, because the mangroves have a very different kind of a geography. It is not an open ocean. Similarly, coral reef is also is one example of a marine ecosystem. There are 9 different ecosystems which exist within the oceans. I've just given you example of 3 of these: the mangroves, or the coral reef, or the salt marshes, etc. These are only 3 examples of 9 ecosystems which you will find in the ocean. Number one. Okay, so here is, for example, this is kind of a coastal ecosystem. Why? Because you see here, if you take a cross section, of an ocean, you will see, like on the left, what you see here is that this is called as a continental shelf. So if many of you have walked along the beach, you will see that gradually, there is a slope which goes downwards up to a certain time. So the waves will come here, and then after this, immediately there is a fall in this. So this part, for example, is called as a continental shelf. Okay, and the rest of it is the deep ocean, for example. So that is where it takes a deep curvature, and then the ocean depth starts right here. And we normally go, this is up to the water level. So we are always here on the beach, but this is the way it goes on the land. So this part is called as the continental shelf. Okay, and this is the deep ocean, for example. And the environments are very, very different here compared to this part. Okay, why is it important? Because many of the rivers, many of the estuaries, etc., they always open into the oceans, as a result of which they are constantly bringing in nutrients. So the kind of a flora, fauna which you are going to see on the continental shelf is going to be very different from what is going to be here. This particular area is very, very rich in nutrients, and it is also called as the neritic region. And that's the reason why you see that there is a demarcation here. So this is entirely pelagic, is the water containing region, but then there is a neritic region and there is an oceanic region, because of the reasons which I have just explained to you just now, because it is very rich in nutrients. Okay, and then based on the depth, the oceanic region which you see here is divided into several zones, okay, depending on the depth, for example. So when you go from 200 meters to 1000 meters, this area is called as mesopelagic, etc., so on and so forth. It's not important to remember these, except it is important to remember that based on the depth, okay, based on the depth, that these regions are very, very different in terms of the kind of life forms that they have in this. And you can understand why it is important, because first of all, light is extremely important in this kind of an ecosystem. Okay, so therefore, in terms of light, what you see is up to 200 meters. This particular region is called as the photic zone. Why? Because you can have algae, you can have photosynthetic bacteria, because in any ecosystem, like there has to be a producer. So if this is let's say it is a continental ecosystem, it's very close to the continent or the land mass. It's not a deep sea. Okay, it's a continental ecosystem very close to the continent or to the land, therefore. Okay, and what you see here, for example, is that this ecosystem should have a producer, and these producers are the microorganisms which are, because you can't have plants in the land. There are algae which are certainly rooted here somewhere on the land, but then they are not free flowing in the oceans. These are only the bacteria which are free flowing in the oceans. So in the photic zone, you will find algae, as well as you will find the photosynthetic bacteria which carry out photosynthesis. They capture the solar energy and they fix it in the form of algal biomass, or these are photosynthetic bacteria which are then eaten up by the primary consumers. Okay, so this zone is therefore called as photic. Up to 200 meters where light can penetrate into this system, you have the photic zone. After that, you have the wavelengths of light, they do not appear in this zone at all. So therefore, photosynthesis is not possible. Okay, so these are the zones which are now shown here. All right, and so let me just read out. So we already saw, for example, the producers, and then at different depths you have the different levels of consumers: the primary consumers, the secondary consumers, the tertiary consumers, so on and so forth. Okay. In addition to that, in an ecosystem, we always define what are the non-living things. So these non-living things for this marine ecosystem are, for example, water, carbon dioxide, oxygen, calcium, which comes out, dissolving from the rocks, which are from the land masses, the nitrogen, the sulfur, and this phosphorus containing salts, which are constantly available, the amino and the humic substances, and small portions of it are available in the solution, but a large portion is held as storage, because in the land mass, there are rocks and other things which are a constant storage house for sulfur and phosphorus containing salts. What are the biotic components? What are the living components of the marine ecosystem? Are the phytoplanktons, which are small microorganisms, bacterial, which are able to photosynthesize. They are called as phytoplanktons. And then there are the algae. These are the eukaryotes, which are also photosynthetic in nature. Then there are consumers and decomposers, etc. Okay.
Ma'am,
So let me read. Yeah, yeah.
ma'am, how rocks? You said rocks are they contain sulfur. So how can they can be consumed?
You see, it is only a small dissolution because many of these rocks, due to weathering action, because within the ocean there are oceanic currents, there is a difference in the temperature here. So there is a slow dissolution of these nutrients from the rocks, which are present in this particular region. Okay, so when we say that a small portion is available in the solution, it is because of the weathering action, because constantly, the water keeps circulating. There is circulation, there is wind action which occurs in these oceanic bodies, which constantly hits, and as a result of which there is a slow solubilization of various rocks, which are going to release these sulfates, or these could be phosphates, etc., which are constantly released into the water bodies. So is that clear? Does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So now very quickly, I have listed down some points which I would like you to understand, is that in any kind of a marine ecosystem, light is extremely crucial for differentiating the marine ecosystem from other aquatic systems. Okay, why? Because when you talk about oceans, you are dealing with depths which you don't see in the lakes or in the pond system. Okay, and there is only as much that the light has all the wavelengths, and the different wavelengths are able to reach only up to a level of 200 meters. And as we go down in this photic zone, okay, there are bacteria which are on the top level, which are able to, which have pigments, which are now let me just bring in, they have chlorophyll A, they have chlorophyll B, etc., which can absorb light of a certain wavelength, 400 nanometer or 700 nanometers. So those wavelengths are not available to the layers which are down below. Then you have bacteria which have now in the second layer, in the third layer, so to speak, they have pigments which are able to absorb the lights of other wavelengths, because 400, 700, 680 nanometers are already taken up by chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. So then the photosynthetic organisms here will not look green anymore. They will have different color. They will have carotenoids. They will look yellow. They will look red, because they have pigments which can capture other wavelengths other than what is now available at that level. Similarly, at 200 meter, there are photosynthetic organisms. Now, whatever is left over, so to speak, they are able to absorb. So, this is a constant, this has occurred as a constant process of evolution. That what is the distribution of these photosynthetic organisms along these layers is something. There is a bacterium which had a mutation in a chlorophyll, or which had a mutation in a carotenoid. Okay, and now it was able to absorb light of a certain wavelength, because this absorption of light by these pigments, it only occurs by changing small functional groups. In chlorophyll, if you have a carboxylic group, it has a certain other absorption spectrum. If it has if it has two methyl groups, then it demonstrates a different absorption spectrum. So the changes which are required in these pigments are not very large. These are very, very small changes which occur in these, and as a result of which now they are able to absorb lights of different wavelengths. Okay, so therefore we will again go back and emphasize that light is extremely crucial for differentiating. By differentiating, what we mean is that, what kind of photic life is going to be here, and that is going to be determined by how much light is going to penetrate up to this level. The trophic status, that is, trophic means the energy status. That is, whether you are a producer, whether you are a primary or a secondary consumer, will depend on the vertical and horizontal positions of a particular site. Okay, so the vertical positioning or the horizontal positionings, compared to continental shelf, are you going to be here or are you going to be somewhere here? That is in deep ocean. Here, because you still have access to a lot of nutrients which are now entering from these rivers and other lakes into the ocean water bodies. So you are going to be very, very different here compared to what you are going to find right here. So the trophic status, whether you are going to be now a primary consumer or a secondary consumer, will depend on where you are positioned here. The supply of substrates is very smallest in the pelagic division. That is, as I mentioned earlier, that the supply of substrate nutrients is very low in this particular region, but then it grows while approaching the coastal line. So the nutrients, etc., become more here on the continental shelf, etc. And the nutrient levels, which are constantly regulated here, they also are responsible for circulation of the oceanic waters. Okay, because this nutrient cycling here occurs because water is going to always flow against if you from a greater concentration, there is osmotic factors which are operating. So depending on if you have very high concentration of nutrients here and low concentration here, water will always be flowing in this direction. So that circulation of water is also controlled by the nutrient concentration. So is that clear to everybody?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so let's try to look at what's really happening in here. So an increase in the nutrient level also encourages circulation of oceanic waters. Okay, and majority of the heterotrophic or the saprotrophic organisms are limited by the supply of organic substrates from the dead bodies of the primary producers. So, what we are trying to say here is that when you say heterotrophic organisms, that is, you look at whales, you look at fish, etc., are very much limited. What kind of organic substrate are they going to feed themselves? Okay, because when you look at fish, etc., which they could be consuming, all right, there is a limitation there. The dead bodies of the primary producers, very limited amount of primary producers are available to them. Okay, so therefore in the marine ecosystem, what you find that there are protozoa, then there are viruses, which are extremely important components of the web chain, because these viruses will act on the phytoplanktons. They will degrade them. These are bacteriophages, which are going to enter into the photosynthetic bacterium. They are going to degrade them constantly, as a result of which the nutrients are constantly going to be made available now. So these nutrients are going to stimulate the growth of the primary producer. So more and more of these bacteria can be produced. Okay, so I don't know whether what I'm saying makes sense to you. So I have another slide to explain it. I'll just go back to that other slide. So marine protozoa and marine viruses are very important components of the food chain in the marine ecosystem. Okay, so now here in this particular slide, I have given you, it is exactly in the marine ecosystem only. So, so who are the primary producers in this ecosystem? These are if you can read, these are, let me just increase this slide a little bit. Okay, so these are phytoplanktons, which are the photosynthetic bacteria, the seaweed, which you see here as the algal seaweeds. So these are the primary producers. And then you have the first level of, these are the primary consumers, which are herbivores, which directly feed on this vegetable matter. These are the zooplanktons. That is, by zoo, what we mean is that these are very small creatures, except that they are animals. Okay, so you will see the difference between zooplanktons and phytoplanktons. When you say phyto, that means these are photosynthetic small organisms. When you say zoo, the word is derived from animal. So these are very, very small animals like protozoa, single cellular animals, which are able to feed on the algae. Or these are cockles, which are again, shelled kind of biological systems which feed on them. So they make up the herbivores, consumers. Then you have the first level, which are carnivorous, or you can call them as second level consumers, which feed on all of these, like the jellyfishes, etc., small fish, etc. They will feed on them. And then you have, for example, the larger fish, then the third level consumers, squids, and finally sharks, dolphins, etc. Are right here. So these are the different levels which are here. Okay, and all of them through biological respiration, they give out heat energy, which is lost through biological respiration. And then there are decomposers also, which are bacteria which feed on the dead organic matter. Everything, so decomposers are also a part of this particular chain. Okay, so I hope you get some kind of an appreciation of this ecosystem, a marine ecosystem. So let's take a break here for about 7 minutes, and then we will reassemble at 10:32. Okay, so we will just take a break here for about 7 minutes.
Okay, ma'am.
Okay, ma'am.
Okay, so has everybody come back?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so
Yes.
I'm not going to spend a lot of time. There is a slide. You please read this on importance of marine viruses in order to understand what is their role in nutrient recycling, etc. And let me just move very quickly now to the other slide. So when you talk about polluting the marine ecosystems, there are just a couple of points which I want to bring to your notice that. Because marine ecosystems, all countries are connected to each other through water bodies, which is actually, a part of the marine ecosystem. So there are national, international agreements which are now signed by different countries in order to ensure that these marine ecosystems are not affected. Although, as it says here, that enforcing these regulations still remains a challenge. So when you look at this ecosystem, what is one of the major problems here is that of plastics. Okay, so plastics, they seem to be localized. Some countries are following very strictly the norms of not using plastics, whereas others are not. But eventually, all the plastics, they end up accumulating in oceans, and it becomes a problem for everybody. So what is shown in this picture on the right is, let me just magnify it a little bit. So what you see here is, for you will recognize this land mass as that of the United States. This is actually the Pacific Ocean right here, what you see in blue. So this is the coast of Western United States, and this is the coast of Japan, and this is Australia. Okay, so you will recognize that this is a part of the Pacific Ocean, and there are large plastic belts which are floating in these oceans, and this is called as a Western garbage patch right here. Because of these oceanic currents, which are the North Pacific winds or the North Equatorial winds, etc., no matter where these plastics are in the Pacific Ocean, but they eventually have collected in the form of this, what is called as a Western garbage patch or the Eastern garbage patch. And they only, these are, you can understand, because if you compare the ratio between the landmass and this garbage patch, you will see how huge it must be. Okay, so they occupy and they just constantly circulate. They are not going anywhere. So these plastics are here, and much of it also accumulates at the bottom of the sea, and it is not accessible for degradation. And they move up in the food web because whales and so many other animals and fish, etc., all these plastics, they end up in the food web, and eventually they end up in humans. So plastics is a big problem as far as marine ecosystem is concerned. The other is a noise pollution. Okay, we never think about noise as being a polluting factor, but then noise pollution is another important thing. And what does it arise? It is due to loud or persistent sounds which are made from traveling ships or sonar devices and different oil rigs which are operating in the ocean in order to drill out the oil. And this disrupts the natural noises which are in the marine environment. What do we mean by that? Now, in the oceans, there is very low visibility and large distances to be covered. Okay, so if a whale is also going, there is a huge distance, very poor visibility, and they're supposed to orient themselves. Now, if you have these kind of noises which are occurring, okay, so these noises are going to distract them from the kind of noises which they create in order to locate themselves in the oceans. Okay, now for example, you have these toothed whales. They use echolocation. They emit sounds which reflect off the surfaces, and this helps them to see in the ocean. Okay, but if you have unnatural noises which are coming, this usually interrupts their communication with each other. It also disrupts migration. It disrupts communication between different whales, hunting and reproduction patterns for many marine animals. Okay, so please try to appreciate how noise pollution can be so disruptive as far as marine ecosystem is concerned. So it is just to give you an example, but so many things you can yourself think about. And similarly, light pollution. Now, light controls the circadian rhythm. in marine organisms as well as in all life forms. About a couple of years ago, there was a Nobel Prize awarded to a physiologist because of uncovering the circadian rhythms which are occurring in the living organisms. So it's extremely important, these natural rhythms which are there, which are regulated in turn by the cycles of by sun, by the length of the day, by length of the night, so on and so forth. And if there is a constant light, like the area where there is an oil rig, for example, those areas are always lit in the ocean. So this disturbs the circadian rhythm in marine organisms, and it also throws into frenzy their patterns of reproduction, how they move, etc. Okay, there are very wonderful videos which are available to see how these turtles, for example, along the sea coast, which are highly lit because of human activities or whatever, you will see that the turtles are completely disoriented. They don't know which way is the sea, they don't know which way is the land, and as a result of which all of these factors affect in order to reduce their population. So on and so forth. Okay, so I hope you are able to understand many of these factors which so pollution doesn't only mean pollution from chemicals, but for a system like a marine ecosystem, noise, light, etc. can also have great impacts. So now, before we leave our concept of ecosystem, I would like to discuss a little bit about what are gradients and ecotones. Now, in nature, for example, you talk about lakes, you talk about forests, etc. But what happens at the boundary of these ecosystems? Because in nature, there is always a gradient, or there is a zonation of physical factors. There could be, for example, there is a temperature gradient. So from Antarctic to the tropics. So if you look at from the pole to the tropic, there is a gradient of temperature. As you move to the equator, there is going to be a gradient of temperature there. Okay. Similarly, there are geographical gradients. As you grow from mountain tops to valleys, there is a geographical distance from the sea level is going to vary, whether it is a mountain top or whether it is a valley. So there is a gradient there. There could be a moisture gradient, for example, wet to dry along the weather gradients. There could be a depth gradient, or which determines the oxygen gradient from shore to bottom of the water bodies, etc. Okay, and because of these, the organisms which are present here, they are also going to change along this gradient. And there could be a sudden change, which is now known as an ecotone. Okay, so an ecotone is created if there are different habitats which are just close to each other. For example, you could have forests and then suddenly you have a water body next to it, which is very, very common. Okay, there are dense forests which could be lining a particular water body. Okay, so those particular areas are called as ecotones, where you have, for example, you have a water body which is lined next to a forest. Now, in that particular zone, or in that intermediary, there are going to be new kind of microbes, and these ecotones are very unique places where life forms are going to be highly diverse and highly variable, because they have learned to be on land as well as in the water. So that is how the life system is going to be very different along the ecotone. And sometimes, these ecotones can also be created by man-made activities, because if there is a deforestation, etc., then you will find suddenly between forests and what has completely become plain now. So because of these gradients, again, the deforestation, etc., it could also lead to a different kind of a biological activity there. So the ecotones could be natural or they could be man-made also. And this is going to have wide repercussions in the ecological systems. So there's a slide to show you this. So, you can have a look at it, try to understand. And what it only tries to indicate is that if this is, for example, the Earth, and this happens to be the southern hemisphere, this happens to be the northern hemisphere. Okay, so the southern hemisphere, when it faces the sun, for example, what is the gradient of temperature which you are going to see here? Or the northern hemisphere, which is which is away from the sun, for example, the kind of a gradient and the kind of temperatures which are going to be found along it is also shown here. And all of these are going to regulate, for example, what kind of life forms are going to be available. So at this zone between 6 to 19, there will be something else, 19 to 26.5, something else, so on and so forth. Okay, and all of this is now translated into different zones which are shown in these pictures. So these are the mountains, the Central Alps, okay, and they are divided into different zones, which are, terms which are used like alpine, subalpine, montane, foothill zone, based on their altitude and based on the amount of sunlight and based on the temperatures which they are capable of attaining. So all of these will therefore be called as ecotones. These sharp boundaries which you see here between 2700 meter to 3200 meter, for example, will be an ecotone. Or between 2100 meter and 2500 meter will be called as an ecotone, where there is a drastic change in the temperature and in the altitude. Okay, so here are just some pictures and which are shown here. Particularly, I want you to look at this one. Okay, so this is a satellite picture of Amazon forest. Now, what you see in green are the forest, but because of man-made activities, that is deforestation particularly, there is some other kind of barren land which has been created, which you see in purple. Okay, so what you see therefore here is that, such kind of man-made activities, or these are sharp boundaries. So everywhere else you see green, but here you see a different kind of a landmass, different kind of a color. Okay, which means that, it is just bare soil and there are no forests here. And so such kind of drastic ecotones can also be captured, and they just make you aware of what man-made activities are doing, and one can just capture them through these kind of pictures. So to sum up our knowledge of ecosystems, so these are very important habitats. Terrestrial ecosystems, I have talked a lot about the marine ecosystems, but these are very important habitats for agricultural production and remediation. And generally, the terrestrial ecosystems are quite resistant to pollution, okay, because they are covered by soil, and soil has humus. So these are actually, they have a lot of these particulate matter, which is the decaying matter from the plants, which is called as humus, which gives them the ability to bind to various kind of pollutants. So soil has a great absorption for pollution. And because of the ability of this terrestrial habitat to resist pollution, the pollution levels can become very high and no short-term measures can be undertaken. Okay, therefore early diagnosis is very important. It's like, until the land really goes very, very bad, you will not be able to detect the pollution in the soil. And then there comes a stage when nothing can be supported. That is, no agricultural practices can be supported by a land mass. Okay, so therefore we say early diagnosis of a terrestrial ecosystem is extremely important. And there is also very complex soil microbial community, and there are so many unculturable microbes which are present with so far unknown metabolic features. Most are slow growing, etc. So therefore, if there is a soil which has gone bad, it would be very difficult to restore it, and it could take years to restore that. So one has to be extremely careful about terrestrial ecosystems. So these ecosystems are important for our survival. So ecosystem of the future must fulfill the different needs and requirements of humans and society. Okay, so it's important to understand what processes control them, so on and so forth. Okay, so with this we close our discussion on ecosystems. So I hope do you have any questions which come to your mind right now?
Just explain the ecotone and what was the significance when we say that.
Okay, well, let me go back to that slide. Okay, see, by ecotone, what we mean is that if there is a very sharp contrast, for example, an ecotone would be you have a water body, you have a lake, and just along the edge you have a forest. Okay, so this particular that is the wall which separates the land, the forest, from the water body will be called as an ecotone, where there is a very drastic change in the habitat. That is called as an ecotone. Okay, now these ecotones could be naturally created. Like, let me go back to this particular slide. So this is a picture which is taken from the satellite of the African continent. So what you see in the northern part of the African continent is all yellow. That shows it is a desert. And then suddenly in the satellite picture, you see all this green zone. So this will be called as an ecotone. Because you see there is a stark difference in you have desert on one hand and you have this green forest on the other land. So such kind of sharpening called as an ecotone. This is a natural ecotone, but what you are looking at in this picture, in this slide D, is a man-made ecotone. Why? Because this is a picture of Amazon forest, and normally it should all have been green. Because in the Amazon forest, which is in South America, you have only forests there. So it should have looked green. But the purple zone actually indicates because of deforestation activity. So forests for wood and other purposes have been taken away. So there is a drastic change now. On one side, there is something else, and on the other side, you have a forest. So because of man-made activities, you can also see such kind of ecotones, which in the long run are going to be harmful for the ecological system, particularly if they are man-made. Okay. So any other question?
Ma'am, I had a question that does these ecotone boundaries shifts like as we are seeing in this picture that Africa had on one side had a desert and other side had a forest. So cannot this ecotone boundary shifted upwards?
See,
Means what are the reasons? Means what are the reasons that ecotone boundaries are at steady state? Means they are not moving. Means
see, because inhabitable nature of the desert, Sahara Desert, for example, because gradually, you may see maybe, how many years down the line that as people move to these areas or as agricultural activities start in these areas over a course of time, you may see that the green zone is going to move up. But that is only going to happen if humans are going to come and they are which happens normally that as populations increase, all these areas which were the dry lands or whatever, people start to move there, people start to have agriculture there, as a result of which then there is a primary layer of bushes, etc. Then something else comes up, then the trees will follow, which is the natural succession of the plant life. And then you may see these green boundaries moving up, but that will take millions of years for that natural gradation to occur. As of now, it is only to illustrate that what is an ecotone, where you have a sharp gradient between two different kind of habitats, which is a vegetation and which is a desert.
yes, ma'am. Okay, ma'am.
Okay, and these are the natural ecotones, but then it can be man-made also, like you see here, or because of lava in this picture. This is a satellite picture of again from northern Africa only, where the brown represents there was a lava flow, as a result of which all the vegetation died around it. Okay, so this brown color which you see here is because of the lava, because of some volcano which had erupted. The lava came out and destroying all the vegetation. So when you were to take a picture, you will see that there is a very drastic kind of demarcation here
Yes, ma'am.
in this. But nevertheless, ecotones are, we have tried to only describe them, but ecotones also provide very, very unique kind of areas where uh, absolutely new kind of life forms are there, which are not present either in the water bodies or in the forest bodies. Because as I said, that they must have the ability or the resilience to grow in the vegetation part, as well as their proximity to water. Like a frog, for example, frog can be on land and it can also be in water. So very new kind of life forms are generally to be seen, or different type of life forms, a lot of diversity in the life forms at these ecotones. So they could provide a very rich resource for biodiversity, and for new kind of microbes could be there. Okay, so with this, I'm going to close, and maybe we should stop now, and we will come back, and then we will start with our second topic, which is on sources of pollution, etc. So any other question in the class regarding ecosystem? Okay, so if not, then let's stop here, and we will come back and we will meet on Thursday.